The Lebensborn program was actually Nazism and racial theory put into practice.
In March 1948, at the end of the 8th Nuremberg trial, the 4 leaders of the Lebensborn project were charged with crimes against humanity.
When World War II ended and the Allies uncovered the horrors of Nazi Germany, the world was shocked by the death camps and gas chambers.
Across the earth, the pictorial record which the world had seen of German death camps would not be readily forgotten either.
But buried even deeper was a secret far more chilling. An official program designed to engineer a master race. Women were lured or forced into participating. Children were stolen, stripped of their identities, and raised to serve a twisted ideal. This wasn't war. It was a biological conquest. And what happened inside these Nazi breeding farms is a nightmare most people have never even heard of. Brace yourself. This is one of the darkest chapters in human history. When Germany lost the Second World War and Allied forces swooped in to clean the mess made by the Nazi, they never expected to encounter a series of events that continues to affect individuals today.
German military leadership doesn't want to have that war. Hitler is pushing an attack on France, and their perception is we're going to lose.
In a building, rows of empty cribs lined the nursery wings. Medical records scattered across abandoned offices hinted at systematic human breeding, and the evidence showed an experiment that ran for at least 2 decades. The soldiers had stumbled upon Heimhochland, one of dozens of facilities across Nazi-controlled Europe where one man indulged his most personal obsession and played God with the lives of people. But these soldiers were about to discover the truth behind the pastoral facade of these maternity homes and a program that would touch the lives of over 200,000 people. The twisted vision of an architect.
A million German men have died in the Nazis' ideological war of annihilation. But who will inherit this world once it is won?
While the rest of the world prepared for the Christmas celebrations on December 12, 1935, Heinrich Himmler unleashed a plan to cleanse the Aryan race through weaponized motherhood. The Reichsfuhrer SS, architect of the Holocaust and guardian of Nazi racial purity, issued his founding decree for the Society for the Care and Welfare of Lebensborn. But why did the man responsible for the systematic murder of millions suddenly concern himself with maternity care? The truth was buried deep in Heinrich's obsession with the future of Germany and his own paranoia. Unknown to the citizens of Germany, this new project was a horrible social experiment disguised as compassionate aid.
On July 14, 1933, a law is passed that legalizes forced sterilization for those with genetic illnesses.
Behind the Nazi propaganda of German racial superiority, there was a disturbing demographic fact that threatened their future. They were dwindling in number at alarming rates. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, birth rates among pure Germans plummeted catastrophically. Meanwhile, populations the Nazis viciously branded inferior, like the Jews, Slavs, and other groups marked for termination, grew and flourished. In Heinrich's twisted worldview, the true Germans faced extinction, but the Lebensborn program would be his weapon of salvation for the Nazi. On the outside, it was a sanctuary for pregnant mothers, but on the inside, it was a breeding ground for human livestock for the 1,000-year Reich. But it was much more than that.
The best thing that a woman in my mother's situation could do was to go to Lebensborn's house to give birth.
You had to be a pure German to even know of its existence, and at the time it was set up, only a few SS officers knew about it. It was set up as a safe haven for the pregnant wives of SS officers, but it quickly ensnared unmarried, genetically pure Germans who were pregnant and needed to give birth outside society's scrutiny. Thus, in 1936, Heimhochland, the first Lebensborn home, was set up in Steinhoring, a village not so far from Munich. With Heimhochland, more and more Lebensborn homes sprang up, but every facility would operate under SS supervision, ensuring ideological purity from conception to adulthood.
They were the product of a disturbing mission that had been started 10 years earlier, the Lebensborn.
But the unsuspecting German people remained blind to the true horror. Heinrich's monstrous vision transcended mere population manipulation. Each Lebensborn facility would function as a nightmarish laboratory for Nazi racial experiments where the regime's perverted theories about heredity and genetics would be tested on defenseless human subjects. Medical collaborators would document every agonizing detail of pregnancy, birth, and early development, constructing databases about optimal human breeding practices. The organization's structure exposed the program's diabolic dual nature as both fraudulent social welfare and ideological abomination.
The perfect children that were born in the Nazi birthhouses, according to Nazi ideology, were supposed to go on to dominate the world.
Local SS overlords would control operations, while specially indoctrinated midwives and doctors, all fanatically vetted for political loyalty, would provide medical care for these twisted experiments. Social workers would scrutinize potential mothers, ensuring only those meeting ruthless racial criteria could participate. An unusual selection process. Imagine being 16, torn from your classroom by teachers you trusted, only to discover they had sold your future to Nazi breeding factories. Young girls, some barely 14, found themselves stripped of their clothes before cold-eyed SS anthropologists and medical teams who measured their skulls like prize cattle, determining their worth as human incubators. The Lebensborn program didn't just seek blonde-haired, blue-eyed women. It hunted girls who would become the weapons for Nazi future.
In 1930, a fertile woman has an average of 2 children, while in 1910 it was 4.
The racial examination began with brutal measurements that shattered dignity. SS-trained anthropologists recorded skull width, nose bridges, eye and hair color. After the basic examination, things took a different turn. The women, some as young as 14 and some slightly older, had to go through a round of medical examination to determine their worth. They were made to take off their clothing, while examiners and photographers captured their bodies from multiple angles, documenting features that would either doom or damn them to forced motherhood. But it wasn't just the women who were screened. Family histories of applicants underwent vicious scrutiny, medical records dissected, and character references from Nazi officials determined whether these children would become state-owned wombs. And that was only the half of it. The standards these women had to meet were merciless. Applicants faced dehumanizing evaluations of racial and hereditary health according to Nazi doctrine. Aryan features and specific facial measurements, supposedly indicating Nordic heritage, became weapons of selection.
The Jews are responsible for communism in the Soviet Union and therefore enemies of the German Reich.
Any whisper of Jewish, Slavic, or Roma ancestry meant immediate, devastating rejection. And several girls watched their dreams of normalcy evaporate because their great-grandmother had darker eyes. Social investigators tortured families psychologically, evaluating backgrounds for mental illness, alcoholism, or criminal behavior. Political reliability mattered as much as genetics. Young women had to prove unwavering commitment to Nazi ideology and willingness to birth future soldiers. Many were coerced by their own parents, betrayed by trusted teachers who promised education but delivered physical exploitation. The girls' fathers faced similar invasive scrutiny, though their participation remained theoretical. Detailed genealogical charts traced paternal lineage across generations, seeking evidence of genetic superiority, while girls waited to learn if they were worthy breeding stock. But when the war raged and ravaged countries, Germany's hypocrisy came to light. Many girls who had been initially rejected for having slightly darker hair, insufficient height, or questionable ancestry found themselves suddenly acceptable when the program expanded. Demographic engineering overcame racial purity when bodies were needed. Under Adolf Hitler's guidance and Heinrich's supervision, medical officers conducted human sorting with terrifying detachment. Post-war reports described these young mothers like livestock, noting breeding value and genetic potential. These examinations reduced teenage girls to collections of measurable traits and hereditary characteristics, stripping away humanity until only reproductive function remained. Life as a Lebensborn woman. Behind sterile walls, watchful eyes of security and false promises of honor, women became prisoners of Nazi ideology, their bodies transformed into vessels for a racial experiment that would haunt them forever. The Lebensborn facilities stripped away humanity through methodical indoctrination disguised as care. But how did these women get pregnant if they were not married? While a few were just unlucky, others had been coerced and manipulated into having intimacy with SS officers and genetically pure Nazi men.
Women who were pregnant by a member of the SS invited to go to the centres towards the end of their pregnancies to give birth.
But for this to work, these women had to believe they were doing the right thing. And so it began. The lies about the honor that came with bearing children for the nation, the brainwashing notion of patriotism, and the fake rewards that came with it. Refusing to be a part of this meant public ostracism for the women and their families. Unfortunately, the manipulation did not end there. The moment the women successfully become pregnant and accepted into the program, their lives ceased to be their own. From their first day in the Lebensborn house, each woman was tagged with numbers or codes, and their personal identity became a profile. Each dawn brought the same crushing routine. Pregnant women, isolated from families and former lives, marched into regimented dining halls where even meals served political poison. Between spoonfuls of prescribed nutrition, they absorbed lectures glorifying their reduction to breeding stock for the master race.
But in 10 years, around 20,000 babies were born in the Nazi maternity hospitals.
Nordic mythology replaced lullabies. Racial theory superseded maternal instincts. Watchful matrons and enforcers of the Nazi doctrine stalked corridors, documenting every whispered doubt and every moment of resistance. And after that, they were subjected to grueling hours of medical examination. Doctors probed not for maternal well-being, but for evidence of genetic superiority. They examined the women, cataloged features, and assessed unborn children like livestock at auction.
Most of the children born were not of Nordic appearance.
Exercise programs were also implemented to push bodies beyond comfort, sculpting future soldiers before birth. And special diets aimed to enhance Aryan characteristics while suppressing any traits deemed inferior were forced upon them. But with all that was imposed upon them, it was the mental trauma that hurt the most. Hidden away in a house all day, communication to the outside world and loved ones were forbidden. The worst part? They were not allowed to speak about past relationships or even show emotions. They had become properties of the Nazi government, and thus no longer tied to anyone. But even birth offered no sanctuary. Delivery rooms draped in Nazi symbols mocked the sacred moment of new life. Newborns received ceremonial silver spoons engraved with SS runes, a brand from their first breath as property of the regime. Birth certificates bore special markings, forever identifying these children as products of ideological breeding rather than love. And the moment they were born from their mothers' bodies, they were snatched away. The mothers never saw their babies again, because like them, the babies were the properties of the government and would be raised by SS officers and loyal Nazi supporters.
The Lebensborn program was created under the SS Welfare Organization.
After their childbirth, the fates of some of these women remained ambiguous. Some moved on, believing they had done their duty. Others remained stuck in limbo, ashamed at being used as breeding cows, while some others faced even worse fates of imprisonment or even death. Decades later, the truth may have come to light, but the trauma remained buried in most lives. Expansion of a dream. It started in Germany as a project for pro-Aryan race growth, but after 7 years, it became a plan for world domination. The first Lebensborn home was set up in 1935, but the first breeding home outside of Germany started in 1939 in Poland.
The Lebensborn project was brought to a halt with the liberation and the fall of the Third Reich.
When German forces invaded Poland, Heinrich did not see blood-soaked battlefields as tragedy, but as fertile ground for his monstrous racial engineering project. But the real prize was Norway in 1941. After Germany conquered and occupied Norway, the Nazi considered the Norwegians racially valuable because their features aligned with the Nazi ideal race. Just like Germany, women in conquered countries were encouraged to have affairs and sleep with Nazi soldiers and officers. By 1942, 9 Lebensborn facilities had infected Norway like parasitic growths, imprisoning both local women and those brutally transported from Germany. By the time the war ended, about 8,000 to 12,000 Lebensborn children had been born in Norway alone, and Lebensborn homes were scattered all over Germany, Poland, Norway, France, Denmark, Belgium, and Netherlands. But while Germany achieved devastating success in Norway and Poland, other occupied territories witnessed desperate struggles. In Belgium and France, brave resistance fighters made operations treacherous, while terrorized populations met these programs with righteous fury and defiant hostility. As the war consumed millions, this nightmarish expansion revealed even darker purposes. With mounting military casualties, Lebensborn facilities transformed into factories for future cannon fodder rather than instruments of genetic improvement. But the most chilling development lurked in Eastern Europe, where Lebensborn operations would intertwine with something even more diabolic and soul-crushing: an organized robbery. A sinister shadow crept across occupied Europe as Nazi Germany's thirst for racial purity transformed from domestic program into monstrous child-snatching operation. The program evolved into systematic kidnapping campaigns that ripped innocent children from their mothers' arms across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. SS officers prowled through villages, Germany for brutal Germanization, a psychological torture designed to obliterate their language, memories, and souls. In one of the most unforgivable crimes of the Nazi regime, thousands of children were ripped from their families' arms, often screaming, confused, and terrified. Their lives shattered in an instant. Children with blonde hair, light skin, or blue eyes, signs of racial value, were hunted like property. Soldiers raided villages, orphanages, and even hospitals, dragging toddlers away from mothers who would never see them again. Parents who resisted were beaten or had their lives snatched away from them. In just Poland, 200 to 250,000 children were snatched away from their homes and families.
Thousands of European children, and many of these children were from Poland and Slovenia.
The stolen children were shipped to Germany, where they were subjected to the brutal process of Germanization, a cold, calculated erasure of everything they once were. But before that, there were the invasive medical procedures that involved forceful blood tests and X-rays. The blood test was to check for racial purity and rule out any Jewish ancestry. X-rays, on the other hand, were to study the children and determine if they truly had any Aryan characteristics. From blood tests, the medicals moved to skull measurements, jawline inspection, ear shape inspection, and height measurements. But unlike routine tests, these children were tested against German characteristics, which meant children who failed did not meet the criteria and were sent to concentration camps. Those who did got new names, new birthdays, and new parents. They were even forbidden to speak their native language and were told their real mothers had abandoned them. Many were beaten if they cried or spoke their old names. Some children forgot who they truly were. Others grew up believing the people who stole them had saved them. The Nazis didn't just take lives. They took identities, memories, and roots, leaving behind a trail of orphans with living parents and families broken beyond repair. The collapse of an empire. Like all things good and bad, there is an end. And in one day, the entire Lebensborn experiment and its accompanying activities came to a halt. When Germany lost the war in 1945,
thousands of these unhappy humans are being freed daily by the Allied armies.
They launched into defense mode, and in a bid to preserve their image and prevent the discovery of their experiments, Operation Lebensborn was destroyed. At the Lebensborn facilities across the crumbling country, staff members worked frantically to destroy evidence of their activities. Birth records of babies born to the women were destroyed, and documents of the kidnapped children were burned to destroy evidence. But the true horror was only beginning. Pregnant women in their final weeks faced impossible choices, attempting dangerous journeys to uncertain destinations, or remaining and hoping for merciful treatment from advancing Allied forces. Many facilities simply abandoned their residents, leaving women and children to fend for themselves in the chaos of Germany's collapse. But the final act of cruelty by the Germans was the destruction of medical files that might have helped reunite families or establish identities. This deliberate erasure of evidence would haunt survivors for decades, making it nearly impossible to trace their origins or locate biological relatives. Allied forces, discovering abandoned facilities, found scattered remnants of the program's ambitions. Hundreds of pregnant women and young children required immediate care, while the destruction of documentation made it nearly impossible to determine their identities or origins. Many spent months or years in displaced persons camps, while authorities struggled to sort out the chaos. But the chaos did not end in Germany only. In occupied territories, the Nazis faced a crisis of their own. They were either forced to go back to their countries or stay and be punished. Norwegian facilities faced unique challenges as the occupation government collapsed. Local Norwegian authorities, themselves struggling with post-occupation reconstruction, found themselves responsible for hundreds of children whose very existence reminded the community of collaboration and national humiliation. The discovery of kidnapped children presented particularly complex problems. Many had been so young when taken that they retained no memory of their original families or communities. Others spoke only German after years of forced assimilation, making communication with potential relatives nearly impossible. Some had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they identified more strongly with their German captors than with their original communities. The backlash.
600 children between the ages of 6 and 12 were given to Lebensborn officials.
Germany may have forcefully conquered and occupied other European countries during the war, but in the end, they were not welcomed anymore. When the war ended, German staff members attempted to flee back to the Reich, often abandoning their charges without adequate provisions or care. This meant leaving behind hundreds and thousands of children born to German fathers and Polish or Norwegian mothers to a horrible fate. Norwegian Lebensborn children faced particularly severe discrimination. Local communities often viewed them as symbols of collaboration and national shame. Some faced violence, social exclusion, and systematic discrimination that continued well into the 1990s. The Norwegian government's failure to protect these children became a national scandal that prompted formal apologies and compensation programs decades later. The search for biological parents became a central preoccupation for many survivors. Organizations were formed to help Lebensborn children locate their origins and connect with surviving family members. But these efforts were often met with frustration, as Nazi authorities had deliberately destroyed many records during the war's final months. Some children managed to locate surviving parents or siblings, leading to emotional reunions that helped heal decades-old wounds. Others found closure through historical research, even when family reunification proved impossible. The prosecution and trial of a century. 2 years after the war ended, the world was yet to recover from the horrors and atrocities of Nazi Germany. It was October 1947. And the officials in charge of the Lebensborn experiment sat in court to atone for their crimes.
Hereby accused as guilty in the respects hereinafter set forth.
Among the defendants sitting in the dock was Dr. Gregor Ebner, a 55-year-old physician whose gentle demeanor belied his role in one of the Third Reich's most chilling social experiments. George had served as chief of the main health department of Lebensborn. As part of the Rouchet A trial, named after the Race and Settlement Main Office, George faced charges alongside 13 other defendants from October 20, 1947 to March 10, 1948. The charges: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations, specifically related to the persecution and extermination of Jews throughout Germany and German-occupied Europe. The evidence presented painted a disturbing picture. Yet when George took the witness stand, he remained defiant. He insisted that Lebensborn had been a benevolent welfare program designed to care for unwed mothers and their children. In his mind, he was not a war criminal, but a physician who had served German families. Ironically, the tribunal ultimately found that the Lebensborn Society was not directly responsible for the kidnapping of children, which was carried out by others. As a result, George, along with 4 other Lebensborn members, was found not guilty on 2 counts of the indictment and was acquitted. The fall of an architect. When Allied forces closed in during the spring of 1945, Heinrich Himmler attempted to negotiate peace.
In 1935, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, launched the program, setting up a network of nurseries in Germany.
Desperately clinging to the delusion that he could somehow salvage his crumbling empire of terror. The architect of the evil breeding farms, once Hitler's most trusted enforcer and the shadowy puppet master behind the SS's reign of unimaginable cruelty, now found himself abandoned by the very Führer he had served with fanatical devotion. Hitler, in his final days of madness in the Berlin bunker, stripped Heinrich of all his titles and branded him a traitor for his secret peace overtures to the Western Allies. The man who had orchestrated the systematic death of millions, who had built his identity around absolute loyalty and racial purity, was now a pariah even among his fellow Nazis. In those final, haunting weeks, Heinrich shed his iconic uniform and donned the humble clothes of a discharged sergeant, complete with false papers identifying him as Heinrich Hitzinger. When British forces captured him at a checkpoint near Lüneburg on May 23, 1945, his feeble disguise crumbled instantly under interrogation. Faced with the prospect of answering for his monstrous crimes, Heinrich bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth during a routine medical examination, dying within minutes in a writhing, agonizing spasm. His body was secretly buried in an unmarked grave on Lüneburg Heath, a fitting end for a man whose victims numbered in the millions, yet who ultimately proved too cowardly to face justice. The aftermath. The Nuremberg trials opened a window into the bureaucratic machinery that had driven the Nazi racial state. Among the thousands of documents presented as evidence, prosecutors introduced records from Lebensborn facilities that revealed the systematic nature of the breeding program. Yet, the legal response to these crimes proved frustratingly inadequate. War criminals faced charges for their roles in planning and executing Nazi policies, but the specific architects of Lebensborn largely escaped serious consequences. Heinrich Himmler's suicide in Allied custody ended any possibility of holding the program's chief architect accountable for his crimes. The legal framework of the time struggled to address crimes that seemed to blur the line between social policy and human rights violations. Unlike concentration camps or mass executions, Lebensborn facilities had provided medical care and comfortable living conditions for their residents, and prosecutors found it difficult to characterize maternity homes as criminal enterprises, even when their purposes clearly served genocidal ideology. This legal blind spot had devastating consequences for survivors seeking justice or recognition. Many Lebensborn children found themselves categorized as collaborators' offspring rather than victims of Nazi crimes. Norwegian authorities initially denied them compensation or support, viewing them as symbols of national shame rather than innocent victims of ideological manipulation. But despite all that, the child kidnapping operations received more serious legal attention, though prosecution remained limited. Military tribunals in occupied territories heard testimony about systematic abduction and forced Germanization. But the perpetrators of these crimes often escaped punishment by fleeing to Allied countries or disappearing into post-war chaos. Social attitudes in post-war Europe complicated survivors' struggles for recognition and justice. Germany's denazification process focused primarily on major war criminals and prominent Nazi officials, largely ignoring the thousands of civil servants, doctors, and social workers who had implemented racial policies at the local level. Many Lebensborn staff members resumed their careers in post-war German institutions with minimal scrutiny. On the other side of the world, international attention to the program's crimes remained limited throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as Holocaust education focused primarily on concentration camps and mass murder, while reproductive crimes and ethnic cleansing received less scholarly or public attention. And, once again, the Lebensborn survivors found themselves marginalized within the broader community of Nazi victims. Until finally, the situation began to change in the 1980s and 1990s as a new generation of historians examined previously neglected aspects of Nazi policy. Academic research revealed the program's true scope and significance, while survivor organizations gained political influence and public recognition. In the 1990s, Norway tendered a formal apology to Lebensborn children, finally creating a turning point in official attitudes toward the program's victims.
For the children of Lebensborn, well, most of them only discovered their true origins much later.
But even in the face of closure, the truth remained that the Nazis' dream of racial engineering had produced not a master race, but a generation of traumatized survivors. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.